She was 23 years old, standing in the doorway of a house that no longer belonged to her, holding a leather satchel that held everything she hadn't sold, and watching her brother-in-law change the lock on the front door, while her mother-in-law stood on the porch and did not look at her. The farm was called Dray Hollow, 80 acres of good bottom land in the Cimarron River country, and it had belonged to the Whitfield family for 31 years before Nora Whitfield's husband went into the river 3 weeks after their first anniversary and didn't come out. Nora had been a Whitfield for 11 months. She was a Caswell again, the morning of the funeral, whether she'd agreed to it or not. Her mother-in-law, a tall woman named Frances Whitfield, had been decent about it, in the way that people are decent when they've already decided what they're going to do and want to feel good about how they did it. She'd given Nora 2 weeks. She'd let her keep the satchel and the wool coat and the pair of working boots that had been a wedding gift. She'd said, quietly, on the morning of the second week, that the farm needed to stay in the family, and that Nora would understand that, and that there was the stage to Pueblo leaving on Friday. Nora had understood it. She'd understood it the way you understand weather. Not because it was fair, but because it was happening regardless. She didn't take the stage to Pueblo. What she had, when she walked away from Dray Hollow with the satchel over her shoulder, was $41, the wool coat, the boots, a bone-handled clasp knife that had been her father's, and a folded paper she'd found tucked inside the lining of the satchel 2 days after her husband's funeral, when she'd been looking for something else entirely. It was a tax receipt, her husband's name on it, and a parcel number, and a property description that ran to 3 lines of cramped legal handwriting. A quarter section out in the Basin country, west of where the river bent south, 160 acres, assessed at nothing, taxes paid through the previous year by a man whose name she didn't recognize. The receipt was 6 years old. She'd taken it to the county clerk's office in Laramie before she left town. The clerk, a man named Sobieski with ink-stained fingers, had pulled the ledger and found the entry and looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. "That parcel's legitimate," he said. "Transferred to your husband's name in 1884. Nobody's filed on it since." He set the ledger down. "It's Alkali flats and hardpan, miss. Nothing out there worth the trip. Is it in my husband's estate?" Sobieski consulted the ledger again. "Doesn't appear to have been listed in the estate filing." Nora looked at him steadily. Then it wasn't part of what the family inherited. He took off his spectacles and rubbed them with his sleeve. "That's a legal question I'm not positioned to answer. I'm not asking you to answer it. I'm asking whether it was listed." It was not. She walked out of the county office with the tax receipt in her coat pocket and 2 weeks of travel ahead of her, and no particular plan beyond the fact that 160 acres of nothing was more than she currently had, which was exactly nothing. The Basin country was 4 days west by stage, and then another day and a half on foot, because the stage didn't go where she was going. She walked the last stretch in October, when the mornings had already gone cold and the skies sat low over the flats in a shade of gray that made everything underneath it look temporary. The land was worse than advertised. The alkali showed white on the surface, in patches like old snow that had forgotten to melt, and the hardpan cracked in a pattern that reminded her of the bottom of a dry creek. There were no trees except for a line of scrub cottonwoods about a quarter-mile north, following what might have been a water source. The grass, where there was any, was coarse and yellow, and lay flat against the ground as if it had given up trying to stand upright. She stood at what she judged to be the approximate center of her 160 acres, and looked in all 4 directions, and found nothing that gave her any particular reason to stay. She stayed anyway. There was nowhere else to go that cost less. She made camp that first night at the base of a low cut bank on the east edge of the property, where the earth had eroded enough to give her 3 sides of shelter and a windbreak. She built a small fire from dead cottonwood branches she'd gathered on the way in, and ate the last of the hardtack she'd been carrying in her coat pocket, and she lay down on the ground with the satchel under her head and the wool coat pulled over her and looked up at the sky. The stars out here were different from the river country. Harder, somehow, and closer. She stared at them until she got cold enough that sleep became necessary, and then she slept. In the morning, she walked every inch of the property. It took most of the day. She moved slow, the way her father had taught her to move on unfamiliar ground, watching her feet and the surface ahead in equal measure. Her father had been a dry land farmer in Kansas for 20 years before the drought broke him, and the main thing he'd passed along to her, besides the clasp knife and a thorough distrust of optimism, was how to read ground. What the color of the soil said about what was underneath it, where water moved even when you couldn't see it. What plants were actually doing when they looked like they were just standing there. The alkali was bad in the eastern third. She already knew that from looking. But the western section was different. The soil there was darker where it showed through the grass, a brownish red that didn't match the pale crust of the alkali flats. She crouched down and dug her fingers in past the surface layer and found the earth underneath came up moist. Not wet, not spring-fed, but holding moisture the way ground holds it when something is moving through it below the surface. She followed the color west until she reached the cottonwoods. There were 11 of them, mature trees, their roots running deep for reasons that didn't have to do with rainfall, because there hadn't been enough rainfall out here to account for trees that size. She put her hand against the bark of the largest one and felt the solid reality of it. A cottonwood that size didn't grow in a place with nothing underneath. She spent an hour walking the tree line, watching the ground, pressing her boot heel into the soil at intervals. At the north end of the trees, where the line curved slightly east, she found what she was looking for, a depression in the ground, subtle enough that you'd walk past it without the right light or the right angle, where the soil had sunk slightly and the grass grew in a slightly different shade of green than the grass around it. She dug with her hands for 10 minutes and hit damp clay at 8 inches. At 14 inches, the clay was wet enough to hold its shape when she pressed it. She sat back on her heels with clay on her hands and looked at the depression and the trees and the distance to the cut bank where she'd spent the night. Subsurface water, not deep or the cottonwoods would be struggling. 10, maybe 15 feet down if she dug a proper well, maybe less. The alkali flats everyone could see. The water table nobody had bothered to look for. She made herself a list in her head, the way she'd always made lists, without paper, just the items arranged in order of necessity. Shelter first, then water, then food, then everything after that in the order it needed to happen. The cut bank was good enough for shelter while she worked. She'd slept in worse. She walked back to camp and started figuring out what she had to do next. The nearest town was Harker, 9 miles east, a cattle shipping point that had seen better years when the railroad was being decided and worse years since. She walked it in 2.5 hours the next morning, arriving before the stores had fully opened, and she stood outside the feed and hardware on the main street and waited. The man who opened the store was named Delbert Coyne, 50 years old, and built like someone who'd done physical work his entire life and wasn't any happier for it. He looked her over the way people look over strangers in small towns, quickly and without appearing to. "I need a hand spade and a post hole digger," Nora said. "And a length of casing pipe if you've got it. 2-inch, 20 feet if you have it, going to dig a well." He said it neutrally, without the commentary she'd been prepared for. "That's right. Where's your claim?" "Basin Flats. West edge, near the cottonwood line." He looked at her. Then he went into the back and came out with a spade and a post hole digger and 3 lengths of 2-inch casing pipe that coupled together to 18 feet, which he said was close enough. $18 for the lot. She had 41. 15, 16.50. She paid $16.50 and carried the tools out to the street and looked at the 9 miles back to the property. The pipe sections were 5 feet each and awkward. She stood there doing the arithmetic of it. Heading out to the flats, a voice from down the boardwalk. She turned. A man in his 60s sitting on a bench outside the barber shop, watching her with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere particular to be. White beard, good boots, the kind of hands that had built things. I've got a mule that needs exercising," he said. "Hector Dawes, Nora Caswell." He looked at the pipe sections. "I'll haul those out for you if you tell me what you're doing with them," she told him. Hector Dawes was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from his bench. "How do you know there's water there?" "The cottonwoods." He went quiet again, this time for longer. "Most people who come out to those flats look at the alkali and leave. Most people look at the surface." He went and got his mule. She dug for 5 days. The post hole digger was the right tool for the first 3 feet and the wrong tool for everything below that, but it was what she had, so she made it work. She widened the hole by hand when she had to, using the spade sideways and a tin cup she'd been carrying in the satchel to clear the loose material. Her hands blistered, and the blisters broke, and she wrapped them in strips of her spare shirt and kept digging. Hector came back on the third day with a younger man who turned out to be his nephew, and the nephew looked at the hole and at the progress she'd made alone and didn't say anything. But he picked up the second spade she'd borrowed from Hector and went to work. She hit wet clay at 9 feet and water at 11.5. Not a rushing spring, not a high-volume well. A slow, steady seep of clean water that rose overnight to a level of about 8 feet down and held there. Enough to fill the tin cup in 30 seconds, which meant enough for a person and a small garden, and eventually something more than that, if she managed it right. She drove the casing and capped the top and stood back and looked at what she had, which was a well in a basin that everyone in Harker had decided was good for nothing. "How'd you know the depth?" Hector's nephew asked. He was 22 or so, a lean, quiet young man named Roy. "I didn't. I dug until I hit something." He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. Most people would have stopped at 7 feet and decided they were wrong, then most people would have been wrong about being wrong. Hector laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and it sounded like something loosening. She built the first shelter against the cut bank, using cottonwood poles she cut from the dead wood along the tree line, and a canvas tarpaulin she'd traded for at Coyne's store in exchange for a week of bookkeeping that Coyne, who hated paperwork, accepted with the speed of a man who'd been waiting for someone to offer. The shelter was low and rough, and the canvas leaked when the rain hit it straight on, but it kept the wind off, and that was enough for the first month. She planted a kitchen garden in the dark soil strip beside the well, late in the season for it, too late for most things, but she put in garlic and winter onions, and a row of turnips that would overwinter if she mulched them right, and a small bed of kale that she covered with burlap on the coldest nights. The alkaline soil on the far end of the plot she left alone. She had plans for it, but plans needed time, and time needed surviving the winter first. Hector Dawes came by every 10 days or so. He never announced himself, just came down the track on his mule and stopped at the edge of the property, and waited to see if she was there. She appreciated this more than she would have said. There was no pity in it. He came the way you check on something you've decided to take an interest in, which was different. One afternoon in November, he stopped at the edge of the garden and looked at the kale for a long time. "That shouldn't be growing," he said. "It is, though. The soil out here." He shook his head. "I've watched 3 families try to work basin land in the last 15 years. None of them stayed past the first hard winter. Dry wells. One family, the Theron outfit, sank 4 wells and got nothing, gave up and went to Colorado." He looked at her well cap. "You hit water on your first try. I hit it on the 11.5 foot of my first try. Most people don't dig that far." She'd been hearing versions of this since she arrived. She was beginning to understand that the failure of the families before her had less to do with the land and more to do with where they'd looked. The alkali was visible, the water was not. They'd seen the surface problem and assumed there was no solution, and so they'd never looked for one. She mulched the turnips in December with dead cottonwood leaves, raked from the tree line, and a layer of coarse sand she carried from the cut bank in her tin cup, trip by trip, until the beds were covered. It was slow, repetitive work, the kind that lets your mind run wherever it wants, while your hands do what they know to do. She thought about the property description from the tax receipt. 160 acres. She was using maybe 3 of them, around the well, and the shelter, and the garden strip. The rest was sitting there being what people called worthless, which really meant they hadn't figured out what it was yet. The alkali flats. She'd been reading about alkali since she got the tax receipt. She'd spent 2 days in the Laramie Public Library before she left town, looking at everything she could find on saline and alkaline soil conditions. What she'd found was more complicated than the story she'd been told. Alkali wasn't dead soil. It was soil with a particular chemical balance. Salinity that killed most crops was also the environment where certain plants not only survived but thrived. Saltgrass, greasewood. And where those plants grew and died and composted over years, they changed the soil around them incrementally, lowering the pH, adding organic matter, preparing the ground for the next thing. The question wasn't whether alkali soil could support anything. It was what it supported now and what it could support if you worked with the chemistry instead of against it. She wrote to the Agricultural College in Fort Collins. It took 3 weeks to get a reply, and when it came, it was written by a professor named Aldous Finch, who clearly hadn't expected a serious inquiry from the Basin country and was cautious about it. But the information was useful. Salt-tolerant forage grasses, a technique for leaching salinity using controlled flooding if she had the water, certain varieties of beet that processed alkali out of the soil as they grew. She didn't have water to spare yet, but she noted everything. The winter was hard and long, and she got through it the way she got through most hard things, by not thinking about the whole of it at once. She thought about today. She thought about what needed doing in the next hour. The well held. The turnips survived under their mulch. The kale died back in February and came up again in March, which she hadn't expected, and which felt like a personal statement from the plant itself. One morning in late February, she woke before dawn to find 6 inches of new snow on the canvas roof, and the temperature dropped enough to make her breath come out in clouds inside the shelter. She lay still for a minute, taking stock of the situation. Water in the well, turnips in the ground, half a sack of cornmeal and a tin of lard she'd gotten from Coyne's store in January. A clasp knife and a set of skills, and the particular kind of stubbornness that doesn't feel like stubbornness from the inside, just like the absence of any acceptable alternative. She got up, built the fire, and went to check the garden. The man who complicated things arrived in March, on a day when the snow had melted off and the ground was showing through in patches, and Nora was digging a second well, or trying to, on the northern end of the property where the dark soil continued, and she thought the water table might extend. He came on a black horse, a big man in his 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular posture of a man who owned enough land that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to. His name, she would learn, was Conrad Pallister. He ran 1,200 acres of grazing land to the south and had been ranging his cattle across the Basin Flats since before the tax receipt had passed to Nora's husband, when the land had sat unclaimed and the water situation had made it undesirable. He pulled up at the edge of the property and looked at the well cap and the garden and the shelter and her, standing in the half-dug second well site with the post-hole digger in her hand. "You're on the Whitfield parcel," he said. "Caswell parcel." It transferred. He looked at the tax receipt she produced without being asked. He took his time reading it. "This is your husband's. My husband is deceased. The parcel wasn't listed in the estate. I've had a lawyer confirm the status." She hadn't had a lawyer confirm anything. She'd had a county clerk look uncomfortable when she pressed him. But she'd also spent 2 hours in the Laramie Courthouse records room before she left, and she was sufficiently confident in her reading of the relevant statutes to say what she'd said. Pallister handed back the receipt. "I've been running cattle across this basin for 11 years. That's a long time to run cattle across someone else's land." His jaw tightened. Not quite enough to be readable as anger, but enough. The land was effectively abandoned. It wasn't abandoned. It was unclaimed. Those are different things. He looked at the second well site, at her hands, at the garden strip along the first well. What are you expecting to do with Alkali Flats? It was the question she'd been thinking about for 4 months. She gave him the short version because he didn't deserve the long one. "I'm going to find out what this land already does, and then I'm going to do more of it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll give you $200 for the parcel." $200 was more than 4 times what she had left from the original 41 after the winter's expenses. It was enough to start over somewhere easier. "No," she said. $250. "Mr. Pallister, I've been living on this property since October. I dug a well in soil everyone in Harker told me was dry. I'm digging a second one. I've had garden vegetables through the winter." She looked at him steadily. "Why do you want land you've been telling yourself is worthless?" He didn't answer immediately, and in the pause she saw exactly what she expected to see. The calculation. The thing behind the eyes that isn't generosity. "My north herd needs winter range," he said finally. "This parcel connects my lower grazing to the river access." River access. She had the westernmost edge of a river easement she hadn't fully understood until just now. The same subsurface water that fed her wells was connected to the river's water table, and the easement on the west boundary was worth more than the land itself if you ran cattle and needed winter water. "It's not for sale," she said. "Move your cattle off my property by end of week." Pallister looked at her the way men look at things they've decided aren't going to stay put. Then he turned his horse and rode south without another word. Hector Dawes, who had arrived on his mule while Pallister was still talking, and who had sat at the edge of the property with his hat brimmed down, rode up after Pallister was out of sight. "Conrad Pallister," he said. "I know. He's got the circuit judge in his pocket. He's taken 2 land disputes in this county in the last 8 years and won both of them." Nora was looking at the post-hole digger in her hand. "Is there another judge?" "Territorial court. Cimarron Falls, 60 miles. How do I get a survey filed?" Hector looked at her. "You'll need a licensed surveyor, and about $30 you probably don't have. What does he take in trade, the surveyor?" Hector scratched his beard. "Harold Vetch out of Cimarron Falls. I know him a little. He's an honest man." He paused. "His wife lost their root cellar in a collapse last fall. He's been storing their winter goods at his neighbor's place." Nora thought about the garden, the turnips, the kale that had come back. The second well, if it held, would support a root cellar on the north end of the dark soil strip. A root cellar she didn't have yet. She also thought about the clay she'd been piling from the well diggings. Good gray clay, the same kind she'd seen used for brick in Kansas when she was a child. She'd been thinking about it as a problem, material to dispose of. She looked at it differently now. "Tell him I'll build him a root cellar," she said. "Proper one. Brick and timber, sited right." Hector was quiet for a moment. "You know how to build a root cellar?" "I know how to build a root cellar better than he can store his winter goods at his neighbor's place." Hector made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'll write to him." She spent the next 3 weeks making bricks. It was not a skill she had, technically, but the principle was simple enough. Clay, water, some coarse sand, for binding, dried in the sun and fired in a kiln she built from flat sandstone stacked in a cone shape with a fire at the base. Her first batch cracked. The second batch cracked less. The third batch came out usable, rough-surfaced and irregular but solid when she tapped them together. She stacked them in rows along the south side of the cut bank to cure. The surveyor came in April. Harold Vetch was a small, precise man in his 60s who traveled with his own set of tools and a leather notebook that he held close to his chest in the wind. He surveyed the property in one long day, walking every boundary line, driving stakes. Making measurements, Nora followed closely so she understood what each one meant. At the western boundary, where the easement ran, Vetch spent 30 minutes measuring and noting before he said anything. "Your easement covers riparian access along the full western edge," he said. "That's water access. Your title is clear." Nora had suspected it. Having a licensed surveyor say it on paper was different from suspecting it. Pallister's been using it. His cattle have been crossing the western line to reach the river, yes. That's encroachment once your ownership is established. Vetch made a notation. "How long has this been going on?" 11 years, according to Pallister himself. Vetch looked at her over his notebook. "He told you that?" He was explaining why he thought he had a right to continue. Vetch wrote something else down. "An established right-of-way argument could complicate your title if you don't file a formal objection to the encroachment and get it on record." "How do I do that?" he told her. She listened and memorized everything he said because she'd learned early that things you needed to remember were better stored in your head than written down in a place someone else might find. After the survey was filed, and the encroachment objection was on record at the territorial court in Cimarron Falls, she kept her side of the bargain. She went to Cimarron Falls herself, traveling with Hector Dawes on his mule cart, with 3 days' worth of bricks loaded in the back. She spent 4 days at the Vetch property, siting the root cellar against the north slope of the kitchen garden hill for natural insulation, laying the brick foundation with the care of someone who understood that the first foot determined everything above it, and framing the roof with timber Vetch had already purchased but hadn't known how to use. His wife, a woman named Pauline, brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked and watched the work with the quiet attention of someone storing information for later. On the last day, Pauline said, "Where did you learn this?" "My father built a root cellar when I was 12. I held the level, and from that you built this." Nora looked at the finished cellar. The door sat flush in the frame. The brick walls had come out straighter than she'd expected on the first real structure she'd ever built. "I didn't just hold the level. I paid attention." Pauline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We've got neighbors who've been talking about putting in a proper cellar for 2 years. Can't find anyone to do it. She looked at Nora. I'm going to tell them about you. Nora thought about the bricks, still curing back at the property. The second kiln she'd built, which was drawing better than the first. The clay coming out of the well excavations that she'd been thinking about as waste. Tell them, she said. She drove home with Hector Dawes and thought about what she'd just done, which was not build someone else's root cellar so much as test a theory. She'd been sitting on clay for 6 months and calling it a problem. The clay was the point. She just hadn't built toward it yet. The brickwork spread slowly, the way things spread in country, where everyone knows everyone's business and news travels with the supply wagons. By June, she had inquiries from 4 properties inside 20 miles, families who'd been meaning to winterize a structure and hadn't gotten around to it. She went to each one, quoted a fair price in cash or trade, and did the work to the same standard she'd done Vetch's cellar, which was the standard her father had used, which was the standard of someone who understood that what you built was going to outlast you and would say something about you when it did. It wasn't fast money. It wasn't any kind of grand enterprise. But it was real work producing real product, and by late summer she had enough cash flow to buy seed stock for a proper spring planting and a small stock of lumber she'd had her eye on at Coyne's yard. She also had what she'd been working toward since October. The second well. It took her 3 weeks of digging over the spring and summer, working on it in the mornings before the brickwork jobs took her off the property. The second well came in at 13 feet, slightly deeper than the first, and produced better volume. She tested it for 2 weeks before she committed to siting the root cellar she'd been planning for the north strip, and when she was sure the level was stable, she laid the foundation herself and began. The root cellar took 3 months, worked around everything else. It was bigger than Vetch's, dug 4 feet into the ground with brick walls from the floor to the ceiling joists, and a timber roof she packed with sod and clay. When she was done and had finished the shelving inside and stood in the cool, still air of it in September, she thought that this was the same feeling the well had given her. The feeling of something that should not exist in a place people had given up on, and did exist, because she'd looked at the actual situation instead of the summary of it. Pallister came back in July. He came with a lawyer this time, a man from Laramie with soft hands, and a document that argued, in formal language, that Pallister's 11 years of continuous use of the western boundary had established a prescriptive easement superseding her riparian rights. She let the lawyer finish explaining this. Then she said, "The territorial court has my encroachment objection on file, dated April 14th. The surveyor's notes state that the encroachment was ongoing at the time of filing." She looked at Pallister. "A prescriptive easement requires uncontested, continuous use. I contested it in April." The lawyer looked at his document. Then he looked at Pallister. Pallister was looking at the root cellar, which had reached the point where the earthen roof was visible above the north strip. He was looking at the bricks, at the garden, which was producing at a level she hadn't predicted when she planted in spring, at the 2 well caps. He looked, and she watched him looking, and she saw the exact moment when the calculation changed, when he stopped adding up what the land was worth to him and started adding up what it was actually worth. "Miss Caswell," he said, and his voice had changed. Not softer, exactly, but different, recalibrated. "I'm going to be direct with you. You've been direct before. I want an agreement on the western easement, seasonal access for my north herd. I'll pay a fair rate, in writing, filed with the territorial court. Of course, and you remove the claim your lawyer just handed me." He looked at the lawyer. The lawyer looked at his document. Something passed between them that she didn't need to hear. "Done," Pallister said. He didn't extend his hand. She didn't either. The terms were to be written and filed, and until then they were just words, and she'd learned not to assign too much weight to words before they were on paper with signatures on them. After Pallister left, Hector Dawes, who had been sitting on his mule at the edge of the property because he'd developed the habit of being present when Pallister arrived, came up to the well cap and dismounted. "That went differently than last time," he said. He did the math. Hector looked at the root cellar. "You've been doing the math since October. I had more time to work on it." He sat down on the flat stone she'd set as a step beside the well. He was quiet for a while in the way he was sometimes quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was deciding whether to say it. "I want to tell you something," he said finally. When you walked into Harker in October with that satchel and asked Coin for casing pipe, I went home that night and I told my wife that girl was going to be dead by February. He paused. Maribel told me I was wrong. She said any woman who came out here in October, looking for a subsurface well instead of running from the alkali, was not the kind of woman who died by February. Nora looked at the well cap. Maribel is smarter than I am, Hector said. I tell her that regularly. She doesn't disagree. There was something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude exactly, and not relief. Something closer to the feeling of being accurately seen by someone who'd been paying attention. Tell her she was right, Nora said. She already knows, Hector said, but I'll tell her anyway. September came in, dry and clear, and the root cellar filled up with what the garden had produced, which was more than she needed alone, and enough to make her think about what next year could look like if she managed the soil the way she was planning to. The leaching system for the alkali section, if she could get enough water, would take 2 or 3 years to show results. The salt grass she'd seeded in spring on the worst of the alkali was establishing. Not breaking down the chemistry yet, just occupying the ground, beginning the long work of preparing it for what came after. She'd written to the agricultural college again, and gotten a better letter back this time, longer, more specific, and she'd been in correspondence with Professor Finch for 3 months now on the particular question of alkaline soil reclamation. He'd sent her a monograph he'd written, unpublished, on saline agriculture in the Intermountain West. She'd read it twice, and marked the sections she disagreed with, and written him back with her reasons, and his reply had been the most useful letter she'd received in a year. One evening in late September, she was sitting outside the shelter, which she'd extended and fortified over the summer, to the point where it was more structure than lean-to, looking at the property in the long flat light that came across the basin at that hour, when the shadow of the cut bank stretched east, and the whole 160 acres was visible at once. The well caps, the garden strip, the root cellar's earthen roof, the salt grass holding the ground in the alkali section, the cottonwoods along the north line, taller than they'd looked in October, or maybe she just knew them better now. 160 acres that a county clerk had told her wasn't worth the trip, that a cattle rancher had tried to buy for $250, and then for a formal easement that Hector Dawes had thought would kill her by February. She hadn't come here because she'd seen what it could be. She'd come because she'd had nowhere else to go, and $41 and a tax receipt with a parcel number on it. She'd started looking at the land honestly because she'd needed to, because she couldn't afford to see what she expected. And what she'd found, underneath the alkali surface, and the hardpan crust and the long history of people deciding without looking, was a water table at 11 feet and clay deposits worth building from, and soil chemistry that was a problem in the way any problem was a problem, which was to say, solvable, if you understood what it actually was. The stage to Pueblo would have taken her somewhere else. Somewhere easier, probably, and smaller, and not hers. She went inside and looked at the correspondence from Professor Finch and the survey map she'd tacked to the interior wall and the brickwork ledger where she tracked the jobs and what they'd paid and what was still owed. She had 3 more cellar projects committed for the fall. She had seed stock picked out for spring. She had a leaching plan for the alkali section mapped on paper and a water schedule that she thought, if the second well held its level, could support the first trial plot by March. None of it was certain. Soil reclamation on alkali flats had been attempted and failed more times than it had succeeded, and she knew that, and she was going to try anyway, because the alternative was to decide in advance what was possible and stop looking. Her father had farmed Kansas dry land for 20 years before the drought broke him, and the thing he'd gotten wrong, the thing she'd watched him get wrong from the time she was old enough to understand it, was that he'd fought the land. He'd tried to make it something different from what it was. He'd planted what he knew how to plant, instead of learning what the ground already knew how to grow. She wasn't going to make that mistake. She'd started by finding the water that was already there, and she'd build outward from that, the way any good structure is built, from what's solid, not from what you want to be solid. The lamp burned low. She trimmed the wick and kept working. Outside, the basin flats lay quiet under the September stars, holding their water table 11 feet down, waiting for someone to keep paying attention. Nora Caswell intended to.